Hello and welcome to my review of A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula Le Guin. A Wizard of Earthsea was first published in 1968 and began the Earthsea cycle that would eventually incorporate a further 4 novels, the last being 2001's The Other Wind, which was also accompanied by a collection of short stories called Tales from Earthsea. The book follows Jed, who is something of a child prodigy, tapping previously unknown powers to save his village from invaders. The manifestation of his powers draws the attention of the wizard Ocean, whose attempts to train Jed don't go particularly well, and Jed leaves to train at what is basically a school for wizards. Not that one. As with Ocean, Jed's impatience and overconfidence leads him into error, and in a strictly against the rules wizardly duel with another student, he inadvertently summons a shadow-like creature that tries to kill him. After graduating, he is sent to a remote island to serve as the resident wizard. While there, he realizes he will never be free of the dangerous shadow, so he does battle with the dragons, threatening the island, and leaves. After a trip across the seas, he winds up in a castle where he discovers that a powerful stone is trying to enslave the local lord. He leaves, returning to Ocean, who tells him that he needs to pursue the shadow rather than the other way round, and he does, eventually forcing a confrontation during which Jed discovers that the shadow is actually a part of himself. He embraces his dark half and returns to his friends, wiser for the experience. The version I have is this 1992 omnibus of the first 4 books, which does not include any of the illustrations from the first edition, which is a bit of a shame. But given there is some critical discussion around A Wizard of Earthsea and its classification as a children's book, that might have been a deliberate attempt to try and court more adult credibility. It might simply have been to save a few pages and therefore a few pennies. However, A Wizard of Earthsea functions very well, illustrations or not. It's fairly short, and this version, which elides white space where it can, comes in at just 168 pages. So it moves along with a pretty brisk pace, which, given its aspirations as a piece of serious high fantasy, perhaps could have done with a bit of easing off. I'm going to compare this to 2 books that are considered some of the genre's high points, and with that lofty praise comes the caveat that it's in the same league, but it's more Everton than Manchester City. The first is Harry Potter. I say this is fairly comparable. The Bildungsroman form suggests this is for a similar audience, perhaps 1 or 2 years older here than with Harry Potter, but it's still easy to read, it's uncomplicated in the plotting, and it's completely inoffensive, and the antagonism between Jed and Jasper in the wizard school certainly has a touch of the Potter Malfoys about it. However, the one thing that this does lack is Hermione. Jed's friends, tutors and enemies are pretty much all male. When women are mentioned, it's usually in passing as only a weak woman, the fact that they're excluded or cowering in doorways. If this was intended as a hypothesis of the utilisation or lack thereof of women in fantasy in the 1960s, it's just a little bit overcooked. And it's a bit of a shame as well, I think, for those young readers who feel they can't manage without a bit of representation. The vibe, though, is certainly Potteresque, and I think part of the discussion whether this is for children or adults is because it finds that right balance of appealing to both the young and the young at heart. The following passage demonstrates Le Guin can write with alacrity and style. This text, where Jed and Seret are fleeing the evil shrouded tower of Terranon, probably a slight misnaming there, or rather gives the game away, but the scene is well paced and its language is accessible to all without compromising its effectiveness. Change yourself, they're coming," Seret shrieked, seizing his arm and pointing to the tower that stood behind them like a tall white tooth in the dusk. From slit windows near its base, dark creatures were creeping forth, flapping long wings, slowly beating and circling up over the walls towards Jed and Seret, where they stood on the hillside, unprotected. The rattling whisper they had heard inside the keep had grown louder, a tremor and moaning in the earth under their feet. I think the last sentence here is particularly good. The rattling whisper is unidiomatic, its unexpectedness heightens a sense of awkwardness. The tremor and moaning in the earth as well sets up these creatures as antithetical to nature as well as dangerous to Jed and Seret. This separation of the word unprotected, which Le Guin could have offered as stood unprotected on the hillside, shows the effectiveness a single word position can make. Positioning unprotected on its own in this way again emphasises that threat. I might, if I had written this, have used fang for tooth here, but it's still a well executed scene, and it leads to a further exploration of the magic system as well. There are a couple of passages towards the end that, while the sequels might resolve, they raised a few questions that broke the immersion Le Guin had handled deftly to that point. This passage on page 1 through 3 is a double exposition. Hot on the heels of already explaining something, we get this. But the truth of this guess he did not learn until years later. The quest of the ring of the Earthsea led him to the Kargad lands and to the tombs of Echuan. It's a shame to explain the unquestions immediately after you already did. It's doubly disappointing because of the sequel bait, and because establishing the further adventures of removes the stakes from this adventure. We now know the outcome. I guess in a young adult novel, even a good one like this, we know the outcome already, but still I'm not a particularly big fan of this sort of thing. I don't see it as heightening the sense of the legendary or epic, so what it detracts is more useful to a writer than what you gain. Le Guin mentions the further adventures of a couple of times, so in that aspect of her writing it's clearly intentional, but she doesn't do the re-explanation again, thankfully. When Jed does take Ocean's advice and he turns around to hunt his adversary, it flees. It's not clear why, and he openly admits to having no idea himself why, or what he's going to do when he finds it. The fact that his plan basically amounts to the classic and equally ineffectual Ghostbusters get her, or in this case get it, is almost unintentionally amusing. As mentioned, the magic system in play here was one of the book's strengths, but there are a couple of things that cropped up that made me begin to question it as well. The first, the assertion by two wizards that meet by chance that wizards never meet by chance, seems like a way of explaining an unlikely plot contrivance. It was unnecessary because Jed knew Vetch's true name and could have called him to his aid anyway. The second is that we learn that the rules of magic change in the outer reaches of Earthsea. In itself, this is fine as part of the system. But in the plot it functions again as a contrivance to remove some of Jed's power as he approaches the final duel. But again, even that as a plot device isn't a particularly bad thing. However, it makes you question the meta strategy of the wizards who train everyone in the Middlelands, even when they're then going to be posted to the Reaches. It's a plan akin to sending them out with minimal training or preparation. It certainly could have spelt disaster if the differences had, for example, manifested themselves when Jed faced off with 8 dragons earlier in the novel. The last thing is that Jed's mutual animosity with Jasper is unresolved, which is fine because obviously it's part of a longer series. But it doesn't seem to stem from very much, and in that it makes him as a character a little less relatable than Harry, for example. However, as Star Wars has recently shown, you can't have a Bildungsroman if your lead has nothing to learn. So it works and isn't especially unconvincing, and young readers more familiar with schoolground politics than I may even see it as something completely normal and disagree with me. In conclusion, The Wizard of Earthsea is a fine story for fans of fantasy regardless of age. Fans of books like Harry Potter or The Hobbit or perhaps even Elric of Melniboné may well enjoy this as well. It's accessible to all, tightly paced and effectively written. My small whinges are just that and may even be explained in the sequels. I'm on record as not being a big fan of long series, which usually outstay their welcome or disappoint when they finally do rumble to an end. But none of the Earthsea novels are especially foreboding, and the verve which Le Guin demonstrates here, and the brevity, means I might check out the second one somewhere down the line. Recommended to fans of fantasy, especially those disappointed by the current crop of young adult fantasy. There are buttons down below for commenting, for liking or not. All those things are provided to you for free by YouTube, so you may as well take advantage of them. I have other reviews you may enjoy as well.